This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're checking in with State Senator James Skoufis, a Hudson Valley Democrat who's looking to address the problem of chronic absenteeism in schools, an issue that has become much more prevalent following the pandemic and is now the topic of attention by multiple legislators. So I want to get into the stakes of this issue of chronic absenteeism because according to the most recent numbers released by the State Education Department, actually during an assembly hearing on this earlier in the year, they said that a little over a quarter of kids during the 2023-2024 school year were chronically absent. And that means they're missing about 10% or more of the school year. I guess it's a little basic, but why does that matter?
Yeah, so let's first put a fine point on what that means. So 10% means you're missing at least 18 days of the school year. And that might not seem like a lot, but I would argue, one, it is.
It definitely seems like a lot. Anyone who's arguing that is not in reality.
And two, for most who are chronically absent, the number is much higher than 18.
Okay.
Now, the quarter or so is the average, and let's zoom out. One, the number is much higher when you're looking at high schoolers who have more independence, they're older, they want to do their own thing, etc. Some school districts, especially in lower income, more urban settings, Rochester is the ultimate outlier. 72% of middle schoolers through high schoolers in the Rochester School District are chronically absent. 72%. Albany and Buffalo's around 60%, north of 60%. There are some school districts where literally the large majority of students are absent more than 18 times a year. And so in some of my school districts in Orange County, Port Jervis, for example, which is a small city school district, predominantly white, by the way, their high school absenteeism is pushing 40%. So this is a pervasive issue around the state across the board, even in suburban and exurban school districts. And why does it matter? We spend untold hours and days and weeks and months every single year in this place, the Capitol, discussing how many billions of dollars to send into classrooms around the state. And that's an important debate that we have every year. There has not been hardly an iota of discussion about the fact that in many of these classrooms, we're debating how many billions of dollars to pump into schools that are chronically more than half absent. More than half of the seats are chronically empty in many of these classrooms. This is a debate that we absolutely have to finally have.
Well, when you think about why this has been an issue that hasn't dominated every single day here in Planet Albany, is it because it is one of those issues that raises some uncomfortable conversations? Because when I think about that hearing that I mentioned at the top with regards to the assembly looking at this issue, some of the things they brought up was this idea that, well, kids are getting a quote-unquote rubber stamp and moving right along to the next grade, so that removes this idea of I need to come to school. And then there was this issue of parental involvement. And anytime we talk about parental involvement, that's always controversial. And then there's this idea of, well, how do you even approach something like this? Is it a discipline issue? And discipline in schools is a controversial one. So is that why we're not talking about this? Or is it because it's a really bad problem and nobody wants to talk about it?
I think it's a mix of a number of reasons. And two of the three are two that you just articulated. The third is that I think the awareness is just not where it needs to be in this place right now. And I'm glad the Assembly is having this conversation. They had this public hearing. We introduced our legislation, which I'm sure we'll get to, late in session last year. Senator Fahey subsequently has also joined as a sort of co-leader of this issue in the state Senate. I don't think a lot of our colleagues understand the depths of this problem. I think everyone superficially knows that it is something of a problem, but until you actually see the numbers and they hit you in the face, I think a lot of folks still don't understand just how grave the situation is in a lot of school districts. And so it's a mix of all three of those factors, I think.
Well, in terms of a response, there's a package of bills that you're part of, and broadly speaking, they include a focus on data, this sort of statewide collection of data, coordinating a response in order to figure out best practices, and this idea of maybe piloting responses. Can you walk us through this as a policy response?
Yeah, so the data, the transparency piece is an important backdrop, but it's not, I would argue, it's not what's going to solve this problem for
Sure,
us here
because
in
it
New
seems
York
like
State.
SED has at least a general understanding of
They
it.
have a general understanding. Their data lags a year or two behind where we are. We do want some more real-time data so that we can more up-to-date track where this is a problem and
Sure.
where it's less of a problem. But we really need to look at Connecticut, one of our neighbors, to actually solve this problem. And they're the nation leader. This has become an exacerbated problem since COVID. And obviously we had remote learning. And I think part of what's driving this. And there are some long-standing drivers from, physical and mental health issues to issues of poverty. But one of the more recent ones since COVID is we had people who were on Zoom. And I think for some families and for some students, they still haven't sort of gotten out of this mentality of, well, I don't really need to show up physically to the school building. I can, sort of take the tests and do the homework and not be seated in a class behind a desk looking at a blackboard for hours on end to be able to adequately learn. And that's obviously a problem. So Connecticut, what they've done is they've put money behind these attendance response teams that they've set up in a variety of really high problem school districts. And over the course of just a short amount of time, what we saw was that where they have these teams doing home visits and setting up particular social service responses within the district, in middle school and high school, they saw a 16% increase decrease in chronic absenteeism is the better way to frame it, which is a very significant drop in these districts. And so this can be resolved. We need to put attention and money and funding behind it. And so that's what our legislation looks to do, in addition to the tracking and the data and the transparency that you touched on.
Well, for a response like that, is it important then that if you're going to fund something like that, one, you identify this is what the money is for, it's not just part of the general foundation aid, and two, though, the way it's awarded maybe isn't as, say, a competitive grant so that only the school districts with the capacity to have that grant writer can access it?
Agreed. And so totally aligned with the first piece, which is this can't just be folded into some larger sum of money and we just hope and trust and expect that school districts will use it to address this problem. It needs to be earmarked. And on the second, and look, there are competing, no pun intended, there are competing sort of schools of thought here. I'm in the school that believes that it should be non-competitive for some of the reasons that you articulated. And because of how pervasive this problem is, we should be sending funds and requiring these teams that I discussed before in each and every school district. Senator Fahey has a slightly different approach. And look, there are arguments we made for each. She has a more piloted approach that is competitive. And the argument there is, well, we might not be able to get a statewide pot of money for every single school district. Let's at least get our foot in the door and then pilot it in certain school districts, have them compete for a smaller amount of money. And then if it goes well, we can make the argument that this has worked and we should expand it. And so there are two schools of thought, but certainly I'm aligned with the first point that you raised.
These are still minors we're talking about. So theoretically, there should be a guardian who is aware that these kids are missing school. So does that open the door for a conversation about Child Protective Services and their role in this? Or is that a can of worms we don't want to unpack because outcomes with Child Protective Services are generally not that great?
This is one of those uncomfortable elements of the conversation that you mentioned before that I think has some folks running in the opposite direction of engaging in this debate. So yes, as I understand it, as Senator Fahey and others who have engaged on this understand it, Child Protective Services is totally hands-off. And many school districts have attempted as a last resort, and that's a key here. This is a measure of last resort. Reach out to CPS. When a parent is aware of a problem involving their kid not going to school and doing nothing about it, and CPS across the state, we're told, just throws their hands up and says, not our problem. So yes, I think that we do need to have this uncomfortable conversation about how to better engage CPS as a measure of last resort when parents are willfully negligent. So yes, our bill does speak to this. It's a measure of last resort, but I think it is an uncomfortable conversation that we need to start having.
Well, with the time we have left, let's turn to a recurring topic that you and I have discussed for 6+ years now since you became chair of the Investigation and Government Operations Committee, which is the regulation of live event ticketing. Obviously, fell short of what you were looking for last year, got the 1-year basically extension of the status quo. What's on the table right now, and is there any way this doesn't become a issue for, I don't know, what am I looking at, June 3rd and 4th, and maybe gets done with a few minutes to spare this session?
I sure hope so. Something's definitely going to happen this year. We punted, as you noted, last year, did a straight, as we call it, 1-year extender, and we're not going to do that again. In fact, you may remember the last iteration of changes came on the heel of a 1-year extender as well. So what's on the table? There's a lot on the table. The most controversial element you and your listeners may remember are restrictions on the reselling of live music tickets in particular. We've advanced a quite aggressive proposal on that item that would blanketly prohibit for profit the resale of any concert tickets in New York State. So you can still resell at face value, below face value. You get sick, you can't attend, you need to offload your ticket, you could still do that. But it would completely lock out this practice, this predatory practice of ticket brokers swooping in, buying hundreds, if not collectively thousands of tickets for a hot concert for the sole exclusive purpose of marking them up 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and locking out average fans who were in line to try and get some of those tickets on the front end.
The Barb Lombardos of the world looking for
That's right, exactly.
Tickets.
Looking out for those folks.
Sure.
So that's still the most controversial element.
And just to be clear, though, my understanding is when you've talked about this in the past, at least in some versions, it was a option for the performer to decide whether they were going to utilize this. Are you saying now what's on the table is just nope, no reselling for profit, period?
Correct. We amended the bill recently to take out that option.
Why that change?
Well, 2 things. One, the other states that allow for that type of option, there's very little uptake. So in California, for example, where there is not transferability, as it's called, of tickets in their state law, musicians can opt into this type of an arrangement. And what we saw was only about 2% of artists opted into restrictions on resale. I don't know if that's just a lack of awareness or interest, or I don't think it reflects a support of resellers gobbling up their tickets and marking them up multiple times. But that was problem number one. And number two was that the folks who mobilized against this last year, the opt-in provision, namely the brokers, obviously, and then also the secondary platforms, think StubHub, SeatGeek, etc., those groups were hair on fire opposed to the opt-in that, practically speaking, as I just mentioned, would have resulted in restrictions on about 2% of the live music events that they engage in. Sure. They were hair on fire, so my perspective was, well, if they're going to be vehemently opposed, we might as well do the full thing. We also speak to something called holdbacks, this unseemly sort of secret that exists whereby thousands of tickets are quite literally held back from the general public to be instead put on sale through special credit card offers, just shared with VIPs, respectfully press, and other stakeholders.
Wait, I could be getting free tickets for stuff?
If you know someone who knows someone, perhaps. There are some press holdbacks.
The Capitol Press Room live from Harry Styles.
That's right. MSG. Sorry, we're trying to put those folks out of business.
Okay.
So that's another piece of this. We're looking at cap fees at 25%, which quite frankly is even higher than I would like to see capped. But nevertheless, there are people who, including Ticketmaster, who do not like the 25% cap on fees. So it's a very comprehensive bill that we're looking to advance. Are we going to get everything? No, but certainly we have our priorities within the bill that we're hoping to get across the finish line this year.
And that was State Senator James Skoufis, an Orange County Democrat. And for more Capitol Press Room content, visit capitolpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.